From the archives of Mayberry County, Vermont. Found among the personal papers of Sheriff Elijah Prentiss, dated 1882 to 1883. Case file #1882-44, regarding the disappearances in the Hemlock Creek vicinity. The following account is compiled from my official duty logs, personal observations, and the sworn testimonies of reliable witnesses. I set it down for the sake of a future record, should the pattern I fear reveal itself more fully to another. I do not expect it to be believed in my lifetime. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper of unease that seeped into the valley throughout the autumn of 1882. Hemlock Creek, a settlement of some 70 souls nestled in a deep, wooded cleft of the Green Mountains, was a place of hardscrabble farms and quiet piety. The troubles started as minor occurrences, easily dismissed by practical folk. A milk pail found soured in the cool of the root cellar. A prized axe head gone missing from a woodshed. Chickens found dead in the coop, not from a fox or weasel, but with their necks wrung clean, their small bodies laid out in a neat row. The first significant event was the disappearance of Old Man Hemlock, the trapper for whom the creek was named. He was a recluse who lived deep in the high timber, coming to town only to trade furs for shot and salt. When he failed to appear for the first snow, few were surprised. The mountain took him, was the general sentiment. It was a harsh land, men were lost to it often enough. But then, in the span of a single month, 3 more vanished. A young farmhand named Jacob Miller, last seen walking the track toward the Gunderson place. Sarah Higgins, a widow who lived alone on the ridge, known for her herb lore. And the Gundersons' youngest boy, Peter, aged 8, who simply did not come home from checking the rabbit snares. Fear, which had been a slow-spreading stain, now became a torrent. Doors were barred at dusk. Men carried their rifles to the fields. The church saw its pews filled each Sunday, the Reverend Miller's sermons on God's protection meeting the pale, strained faces of his congregation. It was I, Sheriff Elijah Prentiss, who was tasked with finding an answer. And in my search, I kept hearing 2 names, spoken low, almost as a curse, the Gracewood boys. Lucas and Silas Gracewood were brothers who lived on the poorest, rockiest farm at the very head of the valley, a place where the sun set early and the shadows lay long. They were men in their middle years, though hardship had carved them into figures of timeless severity. Lucas, the elder, was tall and gaunt, with a preacher's piercing eyes and a manner of speaking that was both quiet and absolute. Silas was broader, stronger, but simple-minded. His eyes held a child's vacancy, and he followed his brother with the dumb loyalty of a hound. They kept to themselves, attending to their stony fields and their single milk cow. They came to town only for necessities, their transactions conducted in silence. There was a strangeness about them, a separateness that had always made the valley folk uneasy. There was no evidence, of course. Nothing tangible. But the whispers persisted. They said the brothers were seen near the Gundersons' fence line the day the boy went missing. They said Silas had been asking after Sarah Higgins's remedies for a sickness in the blood. They said the Gracewood farm had a smell about it, a sweet, coppery scent that clung to the brothers' clothes, a smell that was not of wood smoke or turned earth. Driven by a growing dread and the desperation of the families, I rode out to the Gracewood place on a gray, lowering afternoon in late November. The farm was a picture of bleak isolation. The house was a low, dark cabin of unpainted timber, its roof sagging. A stand of hemlocks pressed in close around it, their branches casting the yard into perpetual twilight. No smoke rose from the chimney. Lucas Gracewood met me at the gate. He did not invite me in. He stood, tall and grim, his hands hanging loose at his sides. "Sheriff," he said, his voice flat. "What business brings you this far?" "I'm inquiring after the missing folk, Lucas," I said, my hand resting near the butt of my revolver. "Peter Gunderson. Sarah Higgins. You seen anything? Heard anything?" His eyes, dark and depthless, held mine. "We keep to our own land, Sheriff. The world beyond the creek holds no interest for us. The mountain is a dangerous place. It claims what it will." From the dark doorway of the cabin, Silas watched us. He held a skinning knife in his hand, turning it over and over. He was smiling a small, vacant smile. Behind him, the cabin's interior was a pool of darkness. And from that darkness, I caught a faint, unmistakable scent, the cloying, metallic smell of old blood. I left with nothing but a colder dread in my heart. I had no cause to search the property. I had only the unshakable conviction that I had been standing at the threshold of something profoundly evil. The disappearances stopped for a time after my visit. The valley held its breath. But the silence that settled over Hemlock Creek that winter was heavier than any snow, and it was filled with the unspoken question: what did the Gracewood brothers do in the long, dark nights up at the head of the valley? And were they truly alone in that crumbling cabin? The spring thaw of 1883 would provide an answer more horrifying than any of us could have imagined. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was one of exceptional severity. Snowdrifts piled high as a man's head, and a deep silence, broken only by the crack of freezing timber, settled over Hemlock Creek. The disappearances ceased, a fact that brought little comfort. The silence felt less like peace and more like the quiet of a predator sated, waiting. The Gracewood brothers were seen even less frequently, their tracks in the snow leading only to their woodpile and back. The isolation of their farm became absolute, a white island at the head of the valley shrouded in suspicion. The thaw came late, in a sudden, muddy deluge in early April. The Hemlock Creek, usually a gentle stream, swelled into a roaring, brown torrent, carving new channels through the sodden earth. It was this violent act of nature that broke the grim stalemate. On the morning of April 12th, young Tommy O'Malley, chasing a strayed pig along the newly raging creek bank, stumbled upon a sight that would haunt him for life. Jammed against a fallen log, caught in a tangle of roots, was a human hand. Not a skeleton, but a hand, pale and water-swollen, the flesh nibbled at by fish. Clutched in its rigid fingers was a shred of blue calico fabric, a pattern recognized instantly by the search party I hastily assembled. It matched the dress Sarah Higgins had been wearing when last seen. We followed the creek upstream, a grim procession of men with shovels and picks, our boots sinking into the cold mud. The brook led us, inexorably, toward the high ground of the Gracewood property. Just before their land began, where the creek bent sharply, the floodwaters had undercut a section of the bank, exposing what had been a carefully concealed pit. The smell hit us first, that same sweet coppery odor I had detected at the cabin, but now multiplied 100-fold, a thick, gagging miasma of decay and lime. The pit was not deep, but it was wide. And it was not empty. We uncovered not whole bodies, but parts. A horror of disassembly. A leg here, an arm there, a torso stripped of its identity. The lime had done its grisly work imperfectly, preserving some flesh while corroding other. It was impossible to get a full count. The remains were a jumbled, nightmarish puzzle. But based on the number of skulls we carefully, reverently exhumed, a task that took the rest of the day and left strong men vomiting into the bushes, we estimated no fewer than 10 individuals. Men, women, and judging by the size of some of the bones, at least one child. Peter Gunderson. The valley's whispered suspicions had become a tangible, stinking reality. The evidence led a straight path to the door of the Gracewood cabin. There could be no more delay. I assembled a posse of 8 men, farmers, storekeepers, all with faces set in grim determination. We were not a mob. We were officers of the law, acting on horrific evidence. We rode out at first light on April 14th, the sky a hard, cold blue. The mud of the track was thick and clinging, as if the land itself sought to slow our progress. The Gracewood farm looked even more forbidding in the clear spring light. The melting snow had left the yard a quagmire, and the cabin seemed to hunker down in it, its dark windows like blind eyes. There was no sign of life. No smoke, no movement. We surrounded the cabin, rifles at the ready. I approached the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hammered on the rough-hewn timber with the butt of my revolver. Lucas Gracewood. Silas. This is Sheriff Prentiss. Open this door in the name of the law. Silence. Then, a faint scraping sound from within. The door creaked open a few inches. One of Lucas's dark eyes peered out. Sheriff, he said, his voice unnervingly calm. You have returned. And you have brought a congregation. "We found the pit, Lucas," I said, my voice tight. "We found what you did. You and your brother are under arrest for murder." A strange smile touched his lips. "Murder? Is it murder to call the weak? To offer purification? The corruption in this valley ran deep, Sheriff. We were merely cleansing." He opened the door fully then. He and Silas stood there, unarmed. They made no move to resist. But it was what lay behind them in the dim cabin that froze the blood in my veins and the words in my throat. The single room was spotless, unnaturally so. The floor was scrubbed raw, the few furnishings neatly arranged. But on the far wall, drawn in what I feared was dried blood, was a large, intricate symbol. A series of interlocking circles and angular lines that made no sense yet pulsed with a malevolent energy. And in the corner, sitting on a low stool, was a boy. He was perhaps 10 years old, dressed in clean but ragged clothes. He did not look up as we entered. He was perfectly still. And when he finally raised his head, I saw why. His eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of an ancient, soulless thing. Solid, glossy black from lid to lid, reflecting no light, showing no emotion. He was one of the cursed kids the old-timers sometimes whispered about, children born wrong, touched by something from the deep woods. Lucas followed my gaze. "Ah," he said softly, "you see, our work is not yet complete. The vessel must be filled." It was then that Silas, his simple face contorted with a sudden, violent devotion, lunged not at us, but for a knife on the table. The crack of a rifle shot filled the small cabin. One of the posse, a man named Henderson, had fired in panic. The bullet took Silas in the chest. He fell with a grunt, a look of profound confusion on his face. Lucas did not flinch. He looked down at his dying brother, then back at me, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying fervor. "The work continues," he said as we moved to shackle him. "You cannot stop it. It is in the soil now. It is in the blood." We led him out, a murderer in chains. The black-eyed boy followed us, silent and unresisting. But as we left that cursed cabin, I knew with a cold certainty that Lucas Gracewood was right. We had stopped 2 men, but we had not stopped whatever terrible ritual they had begun. The evil had not been in the cabin. It had been invited in. And it was still there. The return to Mayberry with Lucas Gracewood in chains and his brother's body wrapped in a tarp was a somber procession. The black-eyed child, whom we'd found in the cabin, walked silently beside my horse, his small hand resting on the saddle leather. He never spoke, never cried, never showed any reaction to the death and horror surrounding him. His unnatural calm was more disturbing than any outburst could have been. We placed Lucas in the single iron-barred cell in the basement of the Mayberry courthouse. The boy we put in the care of Mrs. Higgins, the minister's wife, though she returned within the hour, pale and trembling, saying the child wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, and his unblinking black stare had frightened her own children into hysterics. I ended up having a cot brought into the jailhouse. The boy sat on it, motionless, a silent, watchful statue. For 2 days, Lucas refused to speak. He sat on the cot in his cell, staring at the wall with the same unnerving stillness as the child. On the 3rd day, as I brought him his evening meal of bread and broth, he finally broke his silence. His voice was low, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "You think you have contained it, Sheriff?" he began, not looking at me. "You believe these iron bars are a cage. But they are merely lines on a map. The true work exists beyond such trivial boundaries." I pulled a chair outside his cell. "Then explain it to me, Lucas. What was the work? Why did you and Silas kill those people? Sarah Higgins? The Gunderson boy?" He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes fixing on me. "Kill? Is that what you see? A farmer calls a field of blighted wheat to save the harvest. A doctor bleeds a patient to restore their humors. We were surgeons of the spirit, Prentiss. This valley, this entire world, is sick with a moral rot, a weakness of the soul. It manifests in sloth, in greed, in impurity." He spoke with the chilling certainty of a fanatic. He explained that he and Silas had come to believe they were instruments of a great purification. Their father, a fire and brimstone preacher of the most extreme variety, had filled their heads with notions of sin and damnation from the cradle. But after his death, Lucas's interpretations had twisted into something far darker. "We discovered the truth in the old books," he whispered, leaning closer to the bars. "Not the Bible. Older books. Books that speak of a spiritual calculus. The weakness of the many can be burned away by the focused essence of the few. Strength can be transferred. Purity can be distilled." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "Distilled how?" "A sacrifice is not merely a killing," he said, as if explaining a simple recipe. "It is a process. A release of the vital force. The body is a vessel. When it is opened, with the correct intentions and the proper rites, the energy within is freed. It can then be channeled, harnessed." "The symbols on your wall," I said, my mouth dry. "The pit by the creek. That was the channeling?" He nodded slowly, a gleam of pride in his eyes. "The earth is a conductor. The symbols are a lens. We were concentrating the vitality, Sheriff. Filtering out the corruption. What remained was a pure, potent essence. A cure for the spiritual sickness of this age." "And the boy?" I asked, gesturing to the child on the cot, who, I realized with a start, seemed to be listening intently, though his expression never changed. "Where does he come from? Is he one of your victim's children?" Lucas smiled, a thin, cruel gesture. "He is no one's child. He is the first fruit of our labor. A vessel waiting to be filled. We found him in the woods months ago, empty, a shell. The process is slow. It requires careful, steady infusion." Silas understood that. He was simple, but he had a pure connection to the work. He felt the hunger of the vessel. The pieces of the horror fell into place with a sickening clarity. The disappearances weren't random murders. They were a form of harvesting. The Gracewoods were accumulating vital force through ritualistic killing, believing they could purify the world by funneling this stolen life energy into the black-eyed child. The boy wasn't a victim, he was the intended recipient, the ultimate purpose of their bloody crusade. "You're mad, Lucas," I said, rising from my chair, my skin crawling. "You've killed innocent people because of a deranged fantasy." "Madness and revelation are often indistinguishable to the uninitiated," he replied calmly, turning back to the wall. "The vessel is prepared. The work will continue, with or without us. You will see." I left him then, the stale air of the jailhouse feeling thick with his insanity. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. It was a voice, thin and reedy, coming from the corner where the boy sat. It was the first sound he had made since we found him. He was humming a tune. A hymn. "Shall we gather at the river?" But the melody was off, distorted, played in a minor key that made it sound like a dirge. I looked back down into the gloom of the jail. Lucas Gracewood was still facing the wall, but his shoulders were shaking silently. I realized, with a fresh wave of dread, that he wasn't crying. He was laughing. The circuit judge arrived in Mayberry a week later, bringing with him the full pomp of the Vermont judicial system. The town, still reeling from the horror of the discoveries, attempted to cloak itself in a veneer of procedure and order. The trial of Lucas Gracewood for the murders of 10 individuals was to be held in the Mayberry Town Hall, the largest building available. It was less a trial than a spectacle of collective catharsis. The community needed to see the monster condemned. Lucas was brought into the crowded room each day, his hands and feet shackled. He showed no fear, no remorse. He sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, his gaze distant, as if the proceedings were a tedious interruption to some grander design. He refused the services of the court-appointed lawyer, choosing instead to represent himself, a decision that allowed his twisted philosophy to seep into the record. I took the stand and presented the facts as I knew them: the disappearances, the pit, the grisly remains. I described the cabin, the blood symbol on the wall. I spoke of Silas's death. The gallery listened in horrified silence, the only sounds being the scratching of the court reporter's pen and occasional muffled sobs from the families of the victims. When it was his turn to question me, Lucas rose slowly, his chains clinking. He did not challenge the evidence. Instead, he sought to explain it. "Sheriff Prentiss," he began, his voice carrying through the hushed hall. "You testified to finding a symbol in my home. Would you agree it was drawn with precision? With purpose?" "It was drawn in blood, Mr. Gracewood," I replied coldly. "Blood is life, Sheriff," he said as if correcting a child. "The medium is irrelevant compared to the intent. You see disorder, chaos. I see a geometric formula for spiritual purification. A simpleton sees a dead tree, a carpenter sees timber. You see murder, I see husbandry." The judge gavelled for order as a wave of disgusted murmurs swept the room. Lucas continued, undeterred. He spoke of the weakness of his victims, the widow's loneliness, the farmhand's drinking, the boy's innocence, which he called a liability in a harsh world. He argued that he had not destroyed them, but had refined them, that their essence was now part of a greater, purer whole. It was not a defense. It was a confession and a sermon, delivered with an unnerving, logical calm. The jury, 12 stern-faced farmers and shopkeepers, looked upon him not with anger, but with a kind of terrified fascination. They saw that he was not insane in the way of a raving lunatic. His madness was cold, calculated, and rooted in a warped system of belief that made a terrible internal sense to him. The trial lasted 3 days. There was no doubt of the outcome. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a verdict of guilty on all counts of murder. Judge Hawthorne, his face pale and stern, sentenced Lucas Gracewood to be hanged by the neck until dead, the execution set for 1 month hence. The town should have felt relief. Justice had been served. But a new unease took root. The black-eyed child, who had been kept in a back room of the courthouse under the watch of a deputy, became the focus of a terrible dilemma. He was an orphan, a witness, and something utterly other. No one would take him in. The families of the victims crossed the street to avoid looking at him. The minister prayed over him but would not touch him. I visited the boy each day. He never spoke, never changed his expression. He would eat if food was placed before him, drink if water was offered, but he initiated nothing. His black eyes seemed to absorb the light and the hope from the room. One afternoon, I found the deputy assigned to watch him asleep in his chair, a deep, unnatural slumber from which I had to shake him vigorously to wake him. The boy was sitting exactly as I had left him, but on the floor beside his cot was a dead rat, its neck neatly broken. The night before the execution, a delegation of townsmen, led by the mill owner John Gable, came to my office. Their faces were hard with a fear that had curdled into resolve. "Prentiss, that boy, he ain't natural," Gable said, his voice low. "He's a part of what them brothers done. He's got the devil in him. The town won't be safe while he's here." "What are you suggesting, John?" I asked, though I knew full well. "He should hang with Gracewood," another man muttered from the back of the group. "Finish the business." I refused, of course. I spoke of the law of innocence. But their fear was a palpable force. I increased the guard on the jail, not to keep the boy in, but to keep the mob out. The hanging was carried out at dawn on a scaffold erected in the courthouse yard. Lucas Gracewood walked to the gallows with the same calm detachment he had shown throughout the trial. When the hood was placed over his head, he spoke his last words, clear and firm. "The vessel is ready. The river will flow." The trapdoor opened. The deed was done. As his body swung, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the crowd. It was over. But later that day, when I went to check on the boy, the cell was empty. The deputy was asleep again, a deep, coma-like sleep. The door was unlocked. There was no sign of a struggle. The boy was simply gone. The only clue was a single word, scratched faintly into the stone wall of the cell, as if by a fingernail. A word that made no sense, a word that Lucas had whispered during his final rantings. It read, "Amaranth." The horror of the Gracewood brothers had reached its legal conclusion. But as I stood in that empty cell, I knew with a cold certainty that their work was far from finished. It had simply escaped its cage. In the 2 years following the execution of Lucas Gracewood and the disappearance of the black-eyed child, a fragile normalcy returned to Mayberry County. The horror was buried, not in the earth like the victims of the Gracewoods, but in the silent, determined minds of the people. The name Gracewood was spoken rarely, and only in hushed tones. The abandoned farm at the head of Hemlock Creek was left to the elements, a place children dared each other to approach but never did. The story began to calcify into legend, its sharp edges smoothed by time and retelling. I, however, could not forget. The word scratched into the cell wall, amaranth, gnawed at me. It was a word from an old herbal, referring to a mythical flower that never faded, symbolizing immortality. Was this the purification Lucas sought? A warped form of eternal life? My duties as sheriff continued, but a part of my mind remained trapped in that grim spring of '83. The first hint that the nightmare was not over came in the autumn of 1885. A hunter named Abram Vickers, a sober and reliable man, stumbled into my office, his face ashen. He had been tracking a deer deep in the woods, far beyond the Gracewood property, in an area known as the Blackstone Gorge. There, in a secluded clearing, he claimed to have seen a boy. "He were just standing there, oh, Sheriff," Vickers stammered, accepting a cup of whiskey with a trembling hand. "Knee-deep in the ferns. Didn't move a muscle. It was the same boy from the trial. I'd swear it on a stack of Bibles. But it couldn't have been. He ain't aged a day. Still the same size, wearin' the same ragged clothes. And his eyes. Lord, his eyes were black as pitch." He said the boy had simply turned and melted into the shadows of the trees, moving with an unnatural silence. Vickers was so spooked he had abandoned his gear and run back to town. I led a small party to the gorge the next day. We found nothing but a patch of crushed ferns. No tracks. No sign of a camp. I wrote it off as a trick of the light, a phantom born of fear and guilt. But I did not believe my own dismissal. The following spring, a more concrete and more sinister event occurred. A family of newcomers, the Dawsons, had bought the old Henderson place, the farm adjacent to the cursed Gracewood land. They were a young, optimistic couple from Massachusetts, ignorant of the valley's history. Within 3 months of their arrival, their livestock began to sicken. Not from disease, but from a strange wasting ailment. The animals would simply lose the will to live, refusing food and water until they died. The Dawsons' young daughter, a bright thing of 6 years, took ill with a similar lethargy. The local doctor was baffled. It was Mrs. Gable, the mill owner's wife, who voiced what everyone was thinking. She came to me, her face tight with a superstitious dread. "It's the Gracewood curse, Sheriff. That boy, he's a fetch. He's drawing the life out of that land, just like his masters did. He's hungry." Ridiculous, I told her. But when the Dawsons' dog was found dead on their doorstep, its body unmarked, but its eyes wide with terror, even I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The Dawsons, terrified and bankrupt, packed their belongings and left the valley before the first snow. Their farm stood empty once more. The final, most personal blow came in the winter of 1889. My own deputy, a good man named young Bill Henderson, son of the man who had shot Silas Gracewood, was found wandering on the road to Hemlock Creek, confused and half-frozen. He claimed he had been following a little light through the woods when he became disoriented. When we got him warm and lucid, he described a feeling of being watched and a coldness that went right down to the bone. He resigned the next week, moving to Burlington to work in a factory. He never returned. These incidents, scattered over years, were not proof of anything supernatural. They could be explained by coincidence, by mass hysteria, by the power of a dark story to shape reality. But taken together, they formed a pattern. The legend of the Gracewood brothers was no longer just a story about the past. It was an active, malevolent force in the present. The vessel was not just waiting. It was active. It was testing its boundaries. The evil had not been executed with Lucas. It had been scattered, like a dandelion seed on the wind, and it was taking root in the shadowed places of the county. I began to spend my evenings in the courthouse archives, poring over old land deeds and town records. I was no longer just a sheriff hunting a fugitive child. I was an archaeologist of horror, digging for the source of the poison. I had to understand what amaranth truly meant and what Lucas Gracewood had truly awakened in our quiet valley. The peace we had was a lie. The work, as Lucas had promised, was indeed continuing. my investigation into the history of the Gracewood land became an obsession that consumed my every free hour. The official records in the Mayberry courthouse yielded little. The Gracewood deed was straightforward, a transfer of rocky, undesirable acreage to their grandfather in 1810. It was in the older, more fragmented documents, the diaries of early settlers, the ledgers of the long-defunct Mayberry Historical Society, that I began to unearth a pattern of unease that predated the brothers by generations. The earliest reference I found was in the journal of a Reverend Josiah Millward, the first minister to attempt to establish a congregation in the valley in the 1760s. He wrote of the profound melancholy that hung over the cleft where Hemlock Creek ran, a place the native Abenaki, according to his informants, had named Whispering Stone and avoided entirely. Millward described a peculiar geological feature, a large, flat outcropping of dark, strangely smooth rock near the creek's source, a stone that was warm to the touch even on the coldest of nights, and which the local wildlife shunned. He abandoned his mission after a single winter, citing a miasma of spiritual oppression. Later, in the account book of a fur trapper from the 1790s, I found a cryptic entry beside a sketch of a flower I did not recognize. Sold pelt to Gracewood. Paid in coin and in warning. Says the purple flower that grows by the warm stone keeps his wife young. I say it is the devil's work. The child she bears has eyes like a starless night. The entry sent a jolt through me. Gracewood, the brother's grandfather. The flower had to be the amaranth of Lucas's ravings. And the child with starless eyes. The lineage of this affliction was older than I had feared. The most damning evidence came from a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, tucked away in a box of unsorted papers. They were written by a woman named Eleanor Gracewood to her sister in Boston in the 1820s, the wife of the very Gracewood from the Trapper's Journal. Her early letters were cheerful, filled with plans for the homestead. But over time, a desperate tone crept in. September 12, 1821. Elias is changed since finding that accursed flower. He spends hours by the stone, cultivating it. He claims it holds the secret of vitality, that it can purify the blood. He has begun talking of harvesting. I fear he does not mean the turnips. October 30, 1821. Our little Samuel is a quiet child. He does not cry. He only watches. His eyes are so dark, sister. They see everything and nothing. Elias dotes on him, calls him his perfect vessel. I am afraid. November 15, 1821. A trapper came by today. He is missing. Elias says he moved on. But I saw the stain on Elias's hands when he came in from the field. The amaranth blooms are more vibrant than ever. The letters stopped abruptly after that final, chilling entry. There was no record of what became of Eleanor or the child, Samuel. But the pattern was horrifically clear. The obsession with purity, the use of the strange flower, the creation of a vessel, it was a family creed, passed down from grandfather to father to the brothers Lucas and Silas. They were not the architects of this horror, they were its latest, most violent practitioners. The land itself, with its warm stone and unnatural flora, was the original corrupting influence. Armed with this new, terrible knowledge, I knew I had to see the place for myself. I rode out to the Gracewood farm one last time, long after the leaves had fallen and the skeletal trees stood stark against a gray sky. The cabin was more dilapidated than ever, half swallowed by brambles. I pushed past it, following the creek upstream to its source. And there it was, just as Reverend Millward had described a century prior, a large, flat outcropping of dark, almost metallic rock, unnaturally smooth and free of lichen. The ground around it was barren. And there, in a crevice on the leeward side, grew a patch of flowers. They were a deep, bruised purple, with velvety petals that seemed to absorb the weak afternoon light. The amaranth. Even from a distance of 10 feet, I could feel a faint, unnatural warmth radiating from the stone. The air smelled faintly of ozone and, I fancied, of old blood. This was the altar. This was the wellspring. The Gracewoods had merely built their cabin near the source of the poison. The work was not their invention. It was a ritual imposed upon them by this blighted place. The black-eyed boy was not a one-time creation. He was the latest in a lineage of vessels, stretching back to the unfortunate Samuel in 1821. As I stood there, the silence of the woods felt watchful. I had the overwhelming sensation that I was not alone. I turned slowly. Across the creek, standing motionless between two birch trees, was the boy. He had not aged a day. His black eyes were fixed on me, and in them I saw not the blankness of a child, but the ancient, patient malevolence of the stone itself. He was not a lost orphan. He was the guardian of this place, the living embodiment of its curse. I did not draw my weapon. I knew it would be useless. I simply mounted my horse and rode away, the feeling of those depthless eyes burning into my back. I finally understood Lucas Gracewood's calm certainty. He hadn't been serving a delusion. He had been serving this, an intelligence as old as the stone, that demanded sacrifice and offered a twisted form of eternity in return. We had hanged the servant, but the master remained. And it was hungry. The sight of the boy, unchanged after all these years, solidified a grim resolution within me. This was not a matter for a sheriff's posse or a judge's gavel. The entity, for I could no longer think of it as a child, was a parasite attached to the very land, and the Gracewood bloodline had been its willing hosts. My research suggested a horrifying symbiosis. The amaranth flower was the medium, the sacrifices were the fuel, and the black-eyed vessels were the containers for whatever ancient consciousness inhabited the warm stone. To end this, the cycle had to be broken completely. I confided in only one man, Doc Albright, the county physician who had examined the remains from the pit. He was a man of science, but he had seen the unnatural preservation of those bodies, the strange lack of decay in some tissues. When I laid out the historical record, the journal entries, the letters, the unaging boy, he listened, his face growing graver by the minute. "It defies every law of biology, Elijah," he admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. "But I cannot deny the evidence of my own eyes. If this influence is rooted in a specific geological feature and a plant, then the logical course is eradication. Fire and salt are the ancient remedies for such blights." We planned our expedition for the following week. I would not risk other men's lives. It would be just the two of us. We gathered supplies, kerosene, shovels, sacks of rock salt, and a pair of revolvers more for our own courage than from any belief they would be effective. We told no one our true destination, claiming we were surveying a boundary dispute to the north. The morning we set out, a cold, drizzling rain was falling, turning the world to shades of gray and brown. The journey to the Gracewood farm felt like a ride into the past, every familiar landmark heavy with the memory of horror. The cabin looked like a skull half sunk in the earth. We bypassed it, our horses nervous and skittish, and proceeded directly to the creek source. The clearing felt different. The air was still and thick, the drizzle seeming to avoid the immediate area around the dark stone. The amaranth flowers were in full, grotesque bloom, their purple hue vivid against the dull November landscape. The faint warmth emanating from the stone was more pronounced, a sickly heat that felt like a fevered brow. We worked quickly and silently. Doc Albright, his jaw set, began digging up the flowers, roots and all, throwing them into a pile well away from the stone. I followed, scattering handfuls of rock salt into the disturbed earth, the white crystals hissing faintly as they met the damp soil. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of our labored breathing and the scrape of our shovels. It was when I uncorked the first can of kerosene that we felt it. A change in the atmosphere. The woods, which had been silent, were now listening. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Doc Albright froze, his hand going to the revolver at his hip. "He is here," he whispered. I turned. The boy stood at the edge of the clearing, just as before. But he was not alone. Flickering in and out of sight among the trees behind him were other figures, pale, insubstantial shapes. I saw the gaunt form of Lucas Gracewood, the hulking silhouette of Silas, the sad face of Eleanor from the letters, and others, dozens of others, their features blurred but their presence a wave of cold despair. The valley's dead, the fuel for this abomination, had been summoned. The boy took a step forward. For the first time he spoke. His voice was not that of a child, but a dry, multi-layered rasp, as if many throats spoke as one. You trespass upon sacred ground. The work must continue. The vessel must be filled. I stood my ground, though terror threatened to buckle my knees. The work ends today. I splashed kerosene over the pile of uprooted amaranth and the base of the warm stone. The boy, the entity, let out a shriek that was not of this world, a sound of pure, cosmic rage. He raised a hand, and the spectral figures behind him surged forward. A wave of paralyzing cold hit us. Doc Albright cried out, firing his revolver into the apparitions. The shot passed through them harmlessly, but the noise seemed to stagger them for a moment. It was the opening I needed. I struck a match and threw it. The amaranth flowers ignited with a whoosh, burning with an unnatural green-tinged flame. The fire raced across the kerosene-soaked ground and licked up the face of the dark stone. The entity screamed again, a sound of genuine agony now. The spectral figures wavered and began to dissolve like smoke in the wind. The boy's form contorted, his features shifting, aging rapidly in the flickering firelight. For a fleeting second, I saw the faces of all the Gracewood vessels superimposed over his own. Samuel, the boy from the trial, others I did not know, before they collapsed inward. He did not fall. He simply unraveled, dissolving into a cloud of black mist that was sucked down into the burning stone. The fire burned for an hour. When it died down, the amaranth was ash, and the dark stone was cracked and blackened, its warmth gone, replaced by the chill of ordinary rock. The clearing was just a clearing. The oppressive silence was broken by the normal sounds of the forest, the drip of rain, the call of a crow. Doc Albright and I sat on the ground, exhausted, our bodies trembling with spent adrenaline. We had won. We had broken the cycle. But as we gathered our things to leave, I noticed something that sent a fresh chill through me. In the very center of the largest crack in the stone, where the fire had burned hottest, a single, tiny shoot of green was pushing its way through the ash. It was no bigger than a fingernail, but its leaves were already tinged with a familiar, faint purple hue. The amaranth was not destroyed. It was dormant. And the stone, though wounded, was not dead. We had bought the valley time, perhaps a generation. But the land's memory was long, and the hunger that slept beneath it was eternal. The work was not over. It was merely waiting for new hands to take it up. 20 years have passed since Doc Albright and I confronted the entity at the warm stone. I write this now in the quiet of my study, an old man whose hands are more familiar with the tremor of age than the weight of a sheriff's star. I retired from service 5 years ago, my duty to the living world fulfilled as best I could. Yet the duty to memory remains, a burden I carry alone. Mayberry County prospered in the decades that followed. The Dawson place was bought by a family from New Hampshire who knew nothing of its history. They have raised 3 strong children there, and their cattle are among the finest in the valley. The name Gracewood is rarely spoken, and when it is as a ghost story to frighten children around a campfire, a tale of 2 mad brothers and a lost boy, its sharper edges softened by time. The woods reclaimed the Gracewood farm completely. If one did not know to look, they would never find the foundation stones of the cabin. Doc Albright passed on last winter, taken by a pneumonia that his once robust constitution could not fight off. On his deathbed, his mind clear, he gripped my hand. "The stone, Elijah," he whispered, his voice a faint echo. "Is it still cold?" I assured him it was. He closed his eyes, a measure of peace on his face. I was left as the last man who knew the full, unvarnished truth. Every year, on the anniversary of that day, I make a pilgrimage. The journey is harder now, my old bones protesting the ride and the walk through the thickets. But I must go. I must see. The clearing is unchanged, yet fundamentally different. The great dark stone still sits there, a scar upon the land. The cracks we made with fire and salt are still visible, a web of blackened fissures. For many years, the stone was indeed cold and inert, just a rock. I would sit on a fallen log for an hour, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, and then return home, my spirit a little lighter. But 3 years ago I noticed the first change. A patch of moss growing near the base of the stone had withered and died, not in the way of winterkill, but as if scorched. The following year, I saw the first tendril. A single, slender vine, its leaves a deep, glossy green veined with a faint, almost imperceptible purple. It grew from the deepest crack in the stone center, the very place where I had seen that first defiant shoot after the fire. The amaranth was not gone. It was biding its time, gathering strength from whatever deep, dark well sustained it. This past spring, the vine was thicker, stronger. It had climbed a few inches up the face of the stone. And this time I saw a bud. Small, tightly closed, but unmistakable in its shape. The stone itself was not yet warm to the touch, but the air around it had lost its autumn chill. It was neutral, awaiting stillness. I know what this means. The cycle is not broken. It is dormant. The evil that the Gracewood served is a patient thing. It can wait a century, 2 centuries, for the right conditions to return. For a family with desperation in their hearts and a weakness for dark promises to settle on this land again. The vessel was destroyed, but the altar remains. I will not live to see it awaken fully. That is a small mercy. But the knowledge that I have merely postponed the horror for another generation is a heavy cross to bear. I have thought of telling someone, the new sheriff, a man with a bright, modern mind who would doubtless think me a foolish old man haunted by the past. It would achieve nothing but to undermine what peace this community has earned. So I keep the watch alone. And I write this account. I will seal it with my papers, a testament for some future soul who might face the same darkness. Perhaps they will be better prepared. Perhaps they will find a way to scour the blight from this land forever. As I finish this final entry, I look out my window towards the hills that hide the Gracewood land. The sun is setting, painting the sky in fiery hues. It is a beautiful, peaceful sight. But I cannot help but see, in the deep purple of the gathering twilight, the color of a flower that should not exist. The work is not over. It is only sleeping. And the land remembers. 5 more years have etched their passage upon my face and upon the valley. The tremor in my hand has grown more pronounced, a constant reminder of time's inexorable march. My annual pilgrimage to the stone has become the central event of my year, the axis around which my quiet existence turns. I am no longer merely a retired sheriff. I have become a warden, the sole keeper of a terrible secret. The world outside Mayberry changes at an ever-quickening pace. Automobiles, those noisy, smelly contraptions, are now occasionally seen on the main road to Burlington. Talk of wireless radio and moving pictures fills the newspapers. It is a new century, brimming with a modern confidence that dismisses the shadows of the past as mere superstition. This burgeoning rationality brings me a strange comfort. Perhaps such a world will have no place for the ancient, creeping evil at the head of Hemlock Creek. Perhaps science and electric light will prove to be a final exorcism. But the clearing tells a different story. The changes are slow, subtle, but undeniable. The vine of amaranth is now firmly established. It is no longer a solitary tendril but a robust network of creepers, spiderwebbing out from the central crack in the stone. Its leaves are a darker, richer green, and the purple veins within them pulse with a faint, rhythmic luminescence in the deep shade of the hemlocks. The stone itself has regained a fraction of its former warmth. It is not the feverish heat of before, but a discernible temperature, like blood-warmed flesh, that defies the winter cold. On my visit last autumn, I made a more disturbing discovery. Nestled at the base of the stone, hidden amongst the roots of the amaranth, was a dead fox. Its body was unmarked by tooth or claw, but it was utterly desiccated, as if all moisture and life had been sucked from it in an instant. Its eyes were gone, leaving behind empty sockets that seemed to stare in silent accusation. It was not a natural death. It was a feeding. The stone, or the thing within it, was regaining its strength, drawing sustenance from the life around it. I have taken to visiting more than once a year, my unease growing with each season. I bring a small hatchet with me now, and on each visit, I methodically cut back the amaranth vines, hacking them away from the stone's surface. The sap that bleeds from the cut stems is thick and dark, with a coppery smell that turns my stomach. The task feels pitifully inadequate, like trying to hold back the tide with a teacup. Within months, the vines have always regrown, thicker and more vigorous than before. It is a battle I am destined to lose, but I cannot surrender. The act of resistance, however futile, is all that preserves my sanity. I have begun to dream of the black-eyed boy again. In these dreams, he does not speak. He simply stands in the clearing, pointing at the stone. But now, he is not alone. The spectral forms of Lucas and Silas Gracewood flank him, their faces not twisted in rage, but wearing expressions of serene expectation, like farmers waiting for a promised rain. The dream always ends the same way. The amaranth blooms in a sudden, violent explosion of purple light, and I wake with a start, my heart hammering, the name Amaranth, a silent scream on my lips. The new sheriff, a young man named Peterson, checks on me occasionally. He is kind, respectful of the old legend, but I see the pity in his eyes. He thinks the weight of the past has finally crushed my mind. He advises me to move to town, to be closer to people. He does not understand that my isolation is a shield. To be amongst the bustling, unknowing people of Mayberry would be a torment. My vigilance is a solitary penance. And so I remain in my small house at the edge of town, a relic from a darker time. I watch the modern world advance, and I watch the ancient evil slowly stir in its sleep. I am the thread that connects the two. When I am gone, the knowledge will pass with me. The valley will sleep on, unaware of the poison spreading slowly through its roots. My only hope is that the slumber of the stone will last for centuries more. But as I feel the faint, thrumming warmth through the soles of my boots on each visit, I fear that the awakening will come much, much sooner. The Great War came and went, a distant thunder that shook the world but left the hollows of Mayberry County largely untouched. Young men left and some did not return, their names added to a new monument of grief, a modern counterpoint to the old, unspoken one by Hemlock Creek. The pace of life quickened. The automobile became commonplace, and the first power lines began to stitch their way across the landscape, bringing a harsh, new light to the night. I have become a ghost in my own time. At 80 years old, I am a figure of local folklore myself, old Sheriff Prentiss, who lives with his memories and his quiet madness. My body is a cage of aches and frailty. The journey to the stone is now an ordeal that takes me the better part of 2 days, requiring a wagon and the reluctant assistance of a hired man from town who believes he is humoring an old man's eccentricity. I no longer have the strength to cut back the amaranth. I can only observe and bear witness. The clearing is transformed. The amaranth has won. The dark stone is now almost entirely shrouded in a luxuriant blanket of deep green leaves and twisting, woody vines. The purple veining is more pronounced than ever, and the flowers bloom year-round, small, 5-petaled things of a violet so dark it is almost black. They emit a faint, cloying perfume that hangs heavy in the air, a scent like honey and grave soil. The stone pulses with a steady, low warmth that is palpable from 10 feet away. It is no longer sleeping. It is dreaming, and its dreams are spilling out into the world. The wildlife knows. No bird sings within 100 yards of the place. The forest is silent but for the rustle of the amaranth leaves in a wind I cannot feel. 2 years ago, I found the body of a young deer, collapsed just outside the clearing, its body similarly desiccated as the fox before it. The blight is spreading its roots, drawing a wider circle of death. But the most terrifying change is a new one. On my last visit, as I sat on my familiar log, struggling for breath, I heard it. A whisper. It was not a sound carried on the air, but one that seemed to form directly inside my mind, faint and sibilant, like static from a distant radio. At first, it was meaningless noise. Then, a single word coalesced from the haze. Elijah. It was my name. Spoken in a voice that was not a voice. A composite of hisses and sighs that held a ghastly familiarity. It was the whisper of Lucas Gracewood, the simpleton growl of Silas, the dry rasp of the black-eyed vessel, all woven together. I staggered to my feet, my heart fluttering like a trapped bird. The whisper came again, stronger now, laced with a terrible, possessive familiarity. You have been a faithful keeper. You have watched the garden grow. The vessel is prepared. It needs only a family. The meaning was clear. The cycle was ready to begin anew. The intelligence in the stone, strengthened by decades of slow feeding, was now reaching out, not just drawing life, but seeking willing servants. It needed new hands, a new bloodline to carry on the work the Gracewoods had started. I fled the clearing, my hired man looking at me with alarm as I clambered into the wagon, white-faced and trembling. He did not hear the whispers. The connection was for me alone, the man who had spent a lifetime focused on this evil, whose very blood and bones seemed to have become attuned to its frequency. Since that day, the whispers have not ceased. They are a constant, low-level hum at the edge of my consciousness, a psychic tinnitus. They do not rage or threaten. They remind me of my loneliness, of the futility of my vigil. They speak of power, of a vitality that could reverse the decay of my aged body. They offer a dark communion. I understand now the seduction that ensnared the Gracewoods. It is not just about fanaticism, it is about a profound, soul-crushing loneliness and the promise of purpose, however monstrous. The stone does not just demand sacrifice. It offers a twisted sense of belonging to something eternal. I lock my doors at night now, not against men, but against the voice in my head. I fear that in a moment of weakness, in the confusion of sleep or illness, I might answer. The evil is no longer confined to a patch of land in the woods. It has found a foothold in my mind. I am the last keeper of the secret, and I have become the fragile dam holding back the flood. When I die, the dam will break, and the whispers will go searching for a new, more receptive listener. The whispering had become the very medium of my existence, a constant pressure against the thinning walls of my sanity. It was no longer an external sound but an internal resonance, a vibration that hummed in my bones and colored my every thought. The entity's patience was terrifying. It had waited decades, and it could wait a little longer for my final surrender or my end. It showed me detailed visions of the future, a strong, desperate family named Stonewright arriving in the valley, drawn by the inexplicable fertility of the land near the old Gracewood property. I saw how the corruption would begin not with violence, but with subtle favors and miraculous blessings, a gradual seduction into damnation. This vision of an inevitable future forced a desperate, final plan into my crumbling mind. If I could not destroy the ancient evil with the tools of my time, revolvers, fire, and salt, perhaps I could turn the advancing 20th century against it. I would speak to the new world in its own language, the language of reason and science, and hope it would send emissaries who could succeed where I had failed. For days, I labored at my desk, the pen shaking violently in my grip. I drafted and redrafted a letter to the Vermont State Geological Survey in Montpelier. I carefully excised all mention of the supernatural. There was no talk of black-eyed children, of spectral apparitions, or of ritual sacrifices. Instead, I presented myself as Elijah Prentiss, a concerned retired lawman and longtime resident of Mayberry County. My report described a significant and persistent thermal anomaly located at the headwaters of Hemlock Creek. I detailed the unusual lithological composition of a large rock formation that exhibited metallic stratification and anomalous heat retention properties inconsistent with local geology. I documented the aggressive proliferation of an unidentified species of flowering vine, noting its apparent toxicity to local flora and fauna and its possible connection to the thermal irregularity. I expressed my deep concern that mineral leaching from this site could be contaminating the watershed, posing a potential risk to public health and agriculture. I formally requested a professional survey. It was a pathetic tapestry woven with threads of truth and a handful of scientific terms I had gleaned from old journals. A part of me knew it was futile, but it was the only action left to me that did not involve complete capitulation. I sealed the letter with a sense of finality and gave it to the postman, a silent prayer on my lips to a God I feared had long since turned his back on this blighted corner of his creation. The waiting period was an exquisite torture. The entity seemed acutely aware of my gambit. The whispers did not anger. They became condescending, dripping with a vile amusement. You seek to summon their men of learning? The composite voice of the Gracewoods and their victims hissed inside my skull. They will come with their little hammers and their measuring tapes. They will scratch their heads at the warmth. They will pick our flowers and press them in books. They are children playing at the foot of a mountain. They do not comprehend that the mountain is alive. 3 months later, Sheriff Peterson arrived at my door, holding an official-looking envelope. "Came for you from the state capitol, Mr. Prentiss," he said, his voice respectful but his eyes faintly pitying. My heart thundered as I broke the seal. The letter was brief, typed on crisp government stationery. It thanked me for my civic-mindedness but regretfully informed me that, due to current budgetary limitations and the logistical challenges posed by the remote location, a field survey was not feasible at this time. The author, some junior functionary, suggested the heat likely stemmed from a minor subsurface geothermal vent, or the exothermic decomposition of deep organic deposits. As for the vine, I was advised to consult a county agricultural extension agent. The silent, mocking laughter of the entity echoed through my mind, a psychic wave that left me nauseous and faint. I had been dismissed with a form letter. My attempt to pit the bright, rational future against the ancient darkness had been swatted aside by disinterested bureaucracy. Peterson misread the devastation on my face. "See? Nothing to fret over," he said kindly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Probably just some old swamp gas or a hot spring. You don't need to trouble yourself with these things anymore, sir." When he left, the silence in the house was deeper than ever, filled now with the entity's triumphant, patient presence. The modern world was not an ally, it was merely blind and deaf. My last hope was extinguished. I was the final, failing warden of a terrible secret, and my death would be the starting pistol for a new age of horror. The vigil was over. The defeat was absolute. The returned geological survey letter became a symbol of my absolute failure. I placed it on the mantelpiece, where it yellowed alongside daguerreotypes of men long dead, a monument to the modern world's polite indifference. The entity's whispers now held the calm certainty of a victor surveying a conquered field. They no longer bothered with elaborate visions or temptations. Their message was simple, repetitive, and final. The keeper's time ends. The stone's time begins. My body became my final prison. The chill from my fall never left my bones, confining me first to a chair by the window, then entirely to my bed. Mrs. Henderson, the grocer's wife, came daily now, her face a mask of dutiful pity. She would air out the room, prepare a simple broth, and try to make cheerful conversation about town affairs. I could barely muster responses. The real world, the world of church socials and new road projects, had become a distant, meaningless pantomime. My reality was the four walls of my room and the voice inside my head. The entity began showing me the transfer of power. It was no longer a vague future possibility but an imminent event. I saw the Stone-Wright family with terrifying clarity. A man named Jacob, strong-jawed and desperate after years of drought ruined his farm out west, his wife Martha, a quiet woman with a deep-seated fear of poverty, and their 2 children. I saw their wagon rolling into the valley, drawn by an almost mystical attraction to the affordable, fertile land bordering the Gracewood acreage. The entity showed me how it would guide Jacob's plow to turn up a single, perfect amaranth bulb, which he would plant by his doorstep as a curiosity. The corruption would start as small favors, a sudden end to a child's fever after Martha placed one of the purple petals under their pillow, a rival's well mysteriously running dry while Jacob's never faltered. The descent would be so gradual, so reasonable. "The vigil passes from you to them, Elijah," the whisper cooed. "Your watch is over. You may rest." But I could not rest. A final, stubborn ember of duty refused to be extinguished. If I could not stop the Stone-Wrights from coming, I could at least leave a warning. But to whom? Peterson would dismiss it as the ravings of a dying man. Any document I left would be found among my effects and likely burned as nonsense. The solution came to me on a day when Mrs. Henderson brought her youngest son, Thomas, a boy of about 12, to help with the chores. He was a quiet, serious child with an intelligent gaze. While his mother worked, he sat in the corner, reading a book about natural history. I watched him, and a desperate plan formed. "Thomas," I croaked, my voice a dry rustle. The boy looked up, startled. "Come here." He approached the bed cautiously. I pointed a trembling finger toward an old, heavy chest at the foot of my bed. In that chest, there is a rock collection. From my younger days. Take it. His eyes widened with interest. He dragged the chest open and found the box of specimens I had gathered a lifetime ago. Common granite, quartz, shale. There is a particular rock, I whispered, drawing him closer. I described the dark, warm stone by the creek. I told him its exact location. It is the most interesting specimen in the whole county. It feels warm even in winter, and it has a strange purple flower growing on it. If you are ever exploring, you should find it. Remember it. Study it. It is important. I poured all my remaining will into the words, trying to impress upon him the gravity of the task without speaking of the horror. I was appointing a new, unknowing keeper. A child whose curiosity might one day lead him to the truth before the stone rites were fully ensnared. It was a terrible burden to place on young shoulders, but it was my only hope. Thomas listened, his expression a mixture of fascination and confusion. He nodded solemnly. I will, Mr. Prentiss. I'll remember. That night, the whispers were furious. A final treachery. They shrieked. The child. Your defiance is meaningless. But for the first time in years, I felt a sliver of peace. I had planted a seed. However small, however unlikely to grow, it was a seed of truth. The next morning, when Mrs. Henderson arrived, I asked for a priest. The entity's rage subsided into a cold, watchful silence. It knew the end was near. The final battle for my soul was about to begin. The vigil was ending, but I had, at the last moment, whispered the secret into the future. The arrival of Father Michael O'Malley from St. Brigid's in Burlington marked the final act of my long vigil. Mrs. Henderson, a good Catholic woman, had sent for him, believing my request for a priest signaled a desire for last rites and a peaceful reconciliation with God. She could not have understood that she was bringing a soldier to the battlefield for my soul. The entity within the stone perceived his approach with a fury that made the very air in my room hum. The whispers became a constant, sibilant shriek, a torrent of threats and promises that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. Father O'Malley was a young man, his face still soft with idealism, but his eyes held a core of iron conviction. He smelled of incense and clean wool, a scent from a world untouched by the creeping rot of Hemlock Creek. He sat by my bed, opening his ritual book, his presence a tangible force against the oppressive darkness that filled the room. Peace be with this house and with all who dwell in it, he began, his voice calm and strong. A wave of psychic resistance struck me. The whispers coalesced into a single, desperate command. Send him away. His words are empty noise. We offer you eternity. I clenched my jaw, focusing on the crucifix in the priest's hand. And with your spirit, I rasped. As Father O'Malley began the prayer of anointing, the struggle intensified. The entity dredged up every failure, every moment of fear from my life, projecting them before my mind's eye. It showed me the faces of the Gracewood victims, accusing me of arriving too late. It showed me the black-eyed boy, a testament to my powerlessness. It promised me that the pain of my dying body would cease, that I would be made whole and strong again, a revered elder in the new order of the stone rites. The priest's Latin prayers were a lifeline. I did not understand the words, but their ancient rhythm was a bulwark against the chaos. I felt the holy oil on my forehead not as a mere ritual, but as a cool, cleansing fire. The entity recoiled from it, its whispers becoming shrill, desperate. He cannot save you. It screamed. Your God abandoned this valley long ago. We are your family now. We are your truth. Father O'Malley, perceptive beyond his years, sensed the spiritual tempest raging around us. His prayers grew more forceful. He leaned close, his voice dropping to a fervent whisper. Resist him, Mr. Prentiss. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, I command any unclean spirit to depart from this child of God. A final, terrifying vision assaulted me. I saw the Stonewright family standing in the blooming amaranth field, their faces bathed in purple light, their eyes beginning to darken. They were smiling. The cycle was beginning. My failure was complete. But in that moment of ultimate despair, I found a last reservoir of strength. It was not the strength of a sheriff or a vigilante, but the simple, stubborn defiance of a man who refused to be owned. I turned my head slightly on the pillow, my gaze meeting the priest's. "My papers," I breathed, my voice barely audible. "Just, Thomas." Understanding dawned in Father O'Malley's eyes. He nodded grimly. He finished the last rites, his final blessing a shield around my soul. The whispers did not cease, but they receded, becoming a distant, hateful buzzing at the edge of existence. The entity knew it had lost this battle. Father O'Malley left as the sun was setting. Mrs. Henderson came to check on me one last time. The room was quiet. The oppressive presence was gone. I was alone, truly alone, for the first time in decades. The silence was a physical relief. I did not dream of the stone or the Gracewoods that night. I dreamed of my wife, dead these 40 years, waiting for me on a sunlit porch. As the first light of dawn touched the window, my breathing grew shallow. There was no fear. The whispers were silent. The long watch was over. My final thought was not of the evil I had fought, but of the boy, Thomas, and the fragile seed of truth I had passed on. The vigil was ended. The future was in God's hands, and in the hands of a curious child.